Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The oppressive silence of the Newman Ranch was a lie. A carefully constructed facade of pastoral calm that did nothing to quiet the frantic, hammering rhythm of Nick's heart. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the manicured grounds without seeing them, his knuckles white as they gripped the back of a leather armchair. Every instinct, every primal fiber of his being, was screaming that his son was in danger. The police were moving too slowly, bound by procedure and a lack of concrete evidence, but a father's intuition needed no warrant, required no proof. It was a raw, bleeding certainty that had taken root in his soul from the moment he'd realized Noah was missing, a gnawing terror that was slowly eating him alive. Victor, ever the strategist, was in his study, a modern-day war room, making calls, leveraging his immense power and resources, trying to find a thread to pull in the tangled web of their family's endless conflicts. But Nick couldn't stand the inertia, the waiting. He felt like a caged animal. The polished floors and expensive art of the home, he'd grown up in feeling more like a prison with each passing second. He replayed every recent interaction with Noah, every conversation, searching for a clue he'd missed, a name dropped in passing, a flicker of concern in his son's eyes that he'd been too preoccupied to notice. The guilt was a physical weight on his shoulders, a crushing reminder of every time he'd been too busy, every promise to connect more deeply that had been broken by the relentless demands of their lives. He had failed as a protector, and now his boy was out there, somewhere, scared and alone, and the sheer helplessness of it was a torment worse than any physical pain. It was a forgotten detail, a ghost of a memory, that finally broke through the static of his panic. A week ago, maybe two, Noah had mentioned running into his aunt Phyllis at a coffee shop. It had seemed innocuous at the time, a mere footnote in the narrative of their week. Nick had barely registered it, his mind already on a business meeting or a dispute with another family member. Phyllis was always a tempest, a force of chaotic energy, but she was family, in her own convoluted way, and Noah had always had a soft spot for her, seeing the vulnerability beneath the fiery exterior. But now, in the cold, harsh light of his son's disappearance, that casual encounter took on a sinister new shape. Phyllis was involved. He knew it with a chilling certainty that settled deep in his bones. Her recent behavior had been erratic, even for her. A volatile cocktail of perceived slights and desperate attempts to remain relevant in the Newman orbit. And where there was Phyllis manipulating from the shadows, it was all too easy to imagine Matt, her new accomplice, being pulled into her orbit, his own weak will and thirst for significance making him the perfect pawn in one of her dangerously convoluted games. They were a perfect storm of resentment and poor judgment, and Nick felt a cold fury begin to burn away the helplessness. This wasn't a random act, it was personal. It was a message, a play for something. Power. Revenge. Attention. With Phyllis, the motives were always a tangled mess, but the target was clear, the Newman family. And she had chosen to strike at its most vulnerable point, its heart. His son. Driven by this new, terrifying clarity, Nick abandoned the war room. He didn't tell Victor, didn't call the police. This was a path he had to walk alone, fueled by a paternal rage that demanded a personal resolution. He started with the digital trails, the faint echoes we all leave in the modern world. He called in a favor from a discreet and legally ambiguous IT specialist he'd used for corporate espionage in the past, demanding a deep dive into Phyllis's and Matt's recent activities. He needed patterns, anomalies, anything that stood out. While he waited, his own mind became a detective, piecing together the geography of their lives. He thought of properties, old safe houses, forgotten investments. Phyllis had a history of dramatic exits and hidden returns. She knew how to find places to disappear. He remembered a lakeside cabin she'd talked about buying years ago, a whim she'd had during a brief period of seeking tranquility, a place she said was so remote you could hear your own thoughts. At the time, he'd dismissed it as another one of Phyllis's fleeting fantasies. Now it felt like a lead. He recalled a corporate flat the company had leased for a visiting executive, a bland, anonymous space in a mid-tier building that had been vacant for months. It was the kind of place no one would think to look, the kind of place perfect for hiding something or someone you didn't want found. He made a list, a short, grim inventory of possibilities, each one a potential prison for his child. The break came not from his contact, but from a moment of sheer, desperate luck. Pacing his own apartment, his eyes fell on a framed photograph of him and Noah from a fishing trip years ago. Noah's smile was wide and unguarded, a stark contrast to the grim reality of the present. The pain was a physical ache, and he had to look away, his gaze sweeping across the room and landing on his own car keys tossed carelessly on a side table. And that's when he remembered. Months ago, after a family dinner, Noah had been tinkering with his phone, showing him a new app that could share your location with family members for safety. "Just in case, Dad," he'd said with a laugh, never imagining how prophetic those words would become. Nick had agreed, mostly to humor him, and had promptly forgotten about it. His heart leaped into his throat. Was it still active? Was it possible? Fumbling with his phone, his fingers clumsy with a mixture of hope and fear, he opened the Find My Friends app, an icon he hadn't clicked in what felt like a lifetime. The screen loaded, a map of Genoa City appearing. His own pin was stationary. Victor's was at the ranch. And then he saw it. A third tiny pulsing dot. Noah's dot. It wasn't moving. It was stationary, located not in the city center, not at his apartment, but in a wooded rural area on the outskirts of town, right near the very lake he had been thinking of. The coincidence was too great. This was it. This was the place. A surge of adrenaline, potent and pure, flooded his system. This was no longer a search, it was a rescue mission. The drive to the lake was a blur of tense concentration and white-knuckled fury. He pushed his car well beyond the speed limit, the dark, winding roads a tunnel leading toward his singular purpose. The serene beauty of the moonlit landscape was lost on him. Every shadowed tree, every quiet glen, felt like a potential cover for the atrocity being committed against his son. He parked a mile down the road, killing the engine and the lights, plunging himself into the deep, silent darkness of the woods. The air was cool and damp, filled with the chirping of crickets and the distant call of a loon, sounds of nature that were a stark, almost mocking contrast to the violence of his intentions. He moved on foot, his steps silent and deliberate on the soft earth, his senses heightened to an almost preternatural level. Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a twig made him freeze, his body coiled like a spring. He was a predator now, stalking his prey, and the prey were the people who had dared to touch his child. As he drew closer, the shape of a small, dilapidated cabin emerged from the shadows, nestled amongst the pines. A single weak light glowed from a side window, a beacon of both hope and dread. And there, parked haphazardly behind a thicket, was Matt's beat-up sedan, its presence confirming his every terrible suspicion. The final piece of the puzzle slid into place with a cold, sickening click. He approached the cabin from the rear, using the trees for cover, his breathing shallow and controlled. The structure was old, the wood warped and weathered. He could hear the low murmur of voices from inside, muffled by the walls but unmistakable. Phyllis's voice, sharp and agitated. Matt's lower, more defensive. Nick's blood ran cold then hot. He crept closer, pressing himself against the rough wooden siding near a grimy window. Peering through a small gap in the curtains, his world narrowed to the scene inside. The cabin was sparsely furnished, lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. And there in the corner, tied to a wooden chair, was Noah. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and etched with exhaustion and fear. He looked younger than his years, a boy waiting for a nightmare to end. The sight was a physical blow to Nick's chest, stealing his breath and replacing it with a fire so intense, he thought it might consume him. Phyllis was pacing, her movements jerky and unpredictable, while Matt sat at a small table, looking nervous, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm. They were arguing about what to do next, the plan clearly unraveling. "We can't just keep him here forever, Phyllis. This has gone too far," Matt whined, his voice trembling. "It hasn't gone far enough." Phyllis shot back, her eyes wild. "They need to understand. They need to pay for what they've done to us." They were so engrossed in their own dysfunction, so blinded by their own petty grievances, that they had no idea the storm that was gathering just outside their door. For a long suspended moment, Nick simply watched his son. He saw the subtle tremor in Noah's hands, the way he flinched slightly when Phyllis's voice rose to a shrill pitch. This was his boy, his gentle, artistic son, who valued peace above all else, subjected to this terror. The love Nick felt was a painful, swelling pressure in his throat, but it was instantly forged into a weapon by the white-hot rage. He didn't have a plan, not a detailed one. He had force. He had will. And he had the absolute, unshakable conviction that he would tear this entire cabin apart with his bare hands to get his son out. He moved away from the window, circling to the front door. It was now or never. He took a deep, steadying breath, centering himself, allowing the fury to focus into a cold, sharp point. Then, with a roar that tore from the very depths of his soul, a sound of pure paternal fury, he threw his shoulder against the flimsy wooden door. The lock splintered, the frame gave way with a sickening crack, and the door exploded inward, slamming against the interior wall. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dark night, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a feral light. The scene inside froze. Phyllis let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Matt stumbled backward, knocking over his chair in his panic. And Noah's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief, locking onto his father's. In that single fractured second, the entire world narrowed to the space between them. The fear, the exhaustion, the despair in Noah's face seemed to shatter, and from his lips, in a voice that was barely a whisper, yet which echoed in the sudden silence louder than Nick's explosive entrance, came the two words that would haunt Nick forever and at the same time, give him the strength of 100 men. Help me, Daddy. The sound of that childhood plea, emerging from his adult son in a moment of ultimate vulnerability, unleashed something primal in Nick. He didn't see a room, he didn't see furniture, he didn't see two captors. He saw a threat to his child, and his body moved on pure instinct. Matt foolishly made the first move, charging at Nick with a clumsy, desperate lunge. Nick didn't even break stride. He sidestepped the charge, grabbed Matt by the back of the neck, and with a powerful, contemptuous shove, sent him crashing face-first into the wall. Matt crumpled to the floor with a groan, unconscious or simply unwilling to get up. Phyllis stared, her bravado evaporating, replaced by raw terror as Nick's gaze fell upon her. "Nick, wait, you don't understand," she stammered, holding up her hands, backing away until she hit the far wall. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The promise of utter destruction in his eyes was a language she understood perfectly. He took a single menacing step toward her, and she slid down the wall into a crouch, sobbing, defeated. She was no longer a threat. She was just a broken woman facing the consequences of her most catastrophic mistake. All the fight went out of Nick the moment she was neutralized. His entire being, his entire focus snapped back to the center of the room, to the reason he was here. He rushed to Noah's side, his hands trembling now, not with rage but with a desperate, overwhelming need to make this right. "I'm here, son. I'm here. Daddy's here," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion as his fingers fumbled with the rough ropes binding Noah's wrists. The knots were tight, biting into Noah's skin, and each one he loosened felt like a small victory, a step toward reclaiming his child from the nightmare. The moment the last rope fell away, Noah's body went limp, the strength he had used to endure his captivity finally deserting him. He slumped forward and Nick caught him, pulling him into a fierce, crushing embrace. He could feel the violent shudders racking his son's frame, could feel the dampness of silent tears against his own neck. Nick held him tighter, one hand cradling the back of Noah's head, his own eyes squeezed shut against the hot sting of his tears. "It's okay," he whispered over and over again, a mantra of safety and reassurance. "It's over. I've got you. You're safe now." He wasn't sure if he was saying it for Noah or for himself. In that embrace, the roles of father and son dissolved. They were simply two parts of a whole that had been violently torn apart, and were now, miraculously, being stitched back together. The outside world, with its sirens now wailing in the distance, doubtless alerted by a frantic victor or a neighbor who had heard the commotion, ceased to exist. The pathetic sobs of Phyllis and the groans of the stirring Matt were nothing more than irrelevant background noise. The only thing that was real was the solid, living weight of his son in his arms, the proof that he was alive, that he was safe, that he had been found. Nick had walked through fire and emerged on the other side, his child clutched to his chest. He had answered the plea. He had come. And as he held Noah, rocking him gently, he made a silent, solemn vow to never again let the world get close enough to inflict this kind of pain. The rescue was over, but the healing, he knew, had only just begun. The memory of this night, of that whispered, desperate cry for help, would forever be a scar on both their souls, a dark chapter in the long, turbulent history of their family. But for now, in the dim light of that terrible cabin, it was enough that they were together, and that the nightmare was finally over. Nick had replayed Noah's trembling voice message at least 50 times, each repetition tightening something inside his chest until it felt like his ribs were made of stone. "Dad, help me please." The weak, cracking whisper had been followed by a muffled thud, a scuffle, and then nothing. The police had procedures, interviews, wait times, paperwork. But a father didn't. A father had instincts, and Nick's instincts told him that whatever Phyllis and Matt were doing with Noah had spiraled far beyond the petty manipulation Phyllis had once insisted was necessary to teach Noah a lesson. This was no lesson. This was a nightmare. And he was done letting nightmares run unchecked. He parked the car beside an abandoned service road bordering the old industrial district on the edge of Genoa City, the kind of dead-end place where broken promises and forgotten deals seemed to gather like ghosts. He knew Phyllis's patterns, her hiding spots, her impulsive choices, the places she retreated to when she felt the world closing in. She always picked somewhere isolated enough to keep people out but familiar enough to calm her nerves. The old Langford warehouse fit both. She'd used it once during a meltdown years ago. She'd use it again now. And if Matt Clark was involved, and Nick prayed he wasn't, then this place wasn't just a hideout. It was a cage. The night air smelled of cold metal and damp asphalt as Nick approached the warehouse's rust-edged side door. Half the bulbs in the security lamps were broken, leaving long sections of the building drowned in darkness. He kept his breathing steady, forcing himself to think instead of react. There had to be a reason Noah was here. There had to be something Phyllis thought she was fixing, something Matt thought he was gaining. But none of that mattered next to the image of Noah's frightened voice, begging him for help. Inside, the warehouse groaned with the uneven hum of old generators, each vibration echoing like a distant heartbeat. Nick stepped carefully, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior. A thin strip of light spilled from beneath a partially closed office door on the far side of the floor. Voices filtered through the silence, Phyllis's sharp, frantic whisper and Matt's cold, irritated murmur. Nick moved closer, pressing his back to a steel support beam, straining to catch every word. "I told you he wouldn't understand," Phyllis hissed, her voice fractured by desperation. "Nick always jumps to conclusions. He won't listen, he never listens. If he just stopped and talked to me." Matt cut her off. "Talking isn't going to fix this. The kids saw too much. You said this would be simple, Phyllis. You said Noah could be reasoned with. Instead he grabbed your phone and called his daddy. Now the whole thing is spiraling." Phyllis's breath hitched, and for a moment Nick could hear the raw fear in her tone. Fear he recognized, fear of consequences she thought she could outrun. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I only wanted him to step back just for a moment so I could explain." He was getting too close, asking questions, threatening to go to Nick. "I just needed him calm." "And tying him up is your idea of calm?" Matt snapped. Nick's hands curled into fists so tight his knuckles ached. He fought the urge to crash through the door and tear Matt apart then and there. But he couldn't make the same mistake Phyllis had. He couldn't act on impulse. Somewhere behind that door Noah was scared, confused, maybe hurt. If Nick rushed in blind and Matt panicked, Noah could pay the price. He eased forward, crouching beside a cracked window pane just low enough to offer a partial view. Noah sat on the far wall, his hands bound loosely. Phyllis's panic had made her sloppy, while Matt paced in front of him like a caged animal deciding whether to pounce. Phyllis kept wringing her hands, torn between guilt and fear, her gaze darting constantly back to her son. Noah's eyes were wide but defiant, the kind of look a Newman man carried even when cornered. "Dad's coming," Noah muttered, voice shaky but certain. "He'll find me." Matt gave a humorless half laugh. "That's what I'm trying to avoid, kid." Phyllis spun toward him. "Matt, stop. We're not hurting him. This was never supposed to be that." Matt leaned close to her. "Then maybe you should have thought through your genius plan before dragging me into it." Nick felt the rage rising again, thick and suffocating. He took one steadying breath, then another. He didn't need a plan. He needed precision, timing, and a distraction big enough to pull Matt away from Noah. He slid backward, eyes scanning the shadows until he spotted a metal cart stacked with loose tools, wrenches, hammers, a crowbar, enough noisemakers to wake the dead. If he could knock it over from the opposite side of the room, Matt would instinctively go investigate. Phyllis would stay with Noah, which gave Nick an opening. He crept toward the far wall, muscles tense, heart hammering, every step deliberate. Hold on, son, he thought, his chest tightening with a mix of fear and fire. Dad's here. I'm getting you out.